In our individual lives, we progress through a cycle, common in general but varying according to our karma and environment. We spend our first 7 years under the protective cloak of our parents. Unquestioning and lacking self-consciousness, we exist in a kind of Garden of Eden, where not only our physical needs are taken care of, but also a spiritual force field seems to surround us. Our lives seem in harmony with nature during this period, guided not only by our parents but also by invisible guardian angels that are always just on the edge of our tender vision. As we progress further, we become more and more independent of this overarching divine harmonic cloak, and more questioning of its validity. It seems to smother us, and as we discard it, we take on new, more weighty attachments, consisting of desire and material attractions. We find that by the time we are in our 30s, we are entirely immersed in these attachments. We must work, we must acquire, we must consume. We must satisfy these aggressive desires for sex and external comfort. And finally, we find ourselves totally disconnected from that harmonic inner self that we came into the world with. Finally, at middle age, most of us hit bottom and begin groping for something we cannot quite identify. We are, in effect, homesick. Is this not the current state of humanity at large during the era we find ourselves in? Are we not collectively, as is stated in the wisdom religion, the great orphan, or the pilgrim on an almost endless and rocky path back home? Are we not in a collective middle age, a rock bottom, as far from our home as possible, and most of us so separated from our true selves, that even the concept of that spiritual home is alien to us? It is what the Aryans called the Kali Yuga, or Iron Age. Yet this is the opposite of what we have been taught for the past 150-odd years. We are told that we are at the height of progress, and this is certainly true as concerns the material world as far as we know. But it is undeniable that we have reached a new depth of spiritual degeneracy. It seems that the farther we go back, the purer, the more all-encompassing are the scriptures we find. Manuscripts like the Vedas, the Mahabharata, and at its heart the Bhagavad Gita, present themselves to us as the trunk of a tree in which the branches, forming endless variations of belief, sprout from. Down through history, as these branches manifest themselves, they become more distorted, more liable to manipulation, further from the truth. Some of the branches begin to rot, and need fresh shoots grafted onto them from the pure trunk to carry on what has evolved from a religion to a tribal agenda, an evolutionary survival strategy. Such was the case with the Abrahamic branch. The Aryan Christos, the Logos, a principle far older, in fact eternal in nature, had to be grafted on to the least spiritual of religions for its priesthood to carry on with any kind of legitimacy. What had been cloaked as religious was in actuality a national, racial, tribal survival strategy. This tribe deemed themselves the chosen of God, and their leaders began a process of separating its members from the rest of humanity, deemed as unclean by their priesthood. The run-of-the-mill members of this tribe became captive to its leaders and a vicious, judgmental, and ultimately genocidal deity, the most important aspect of which was its nature of separateness. This separation from deity was the crucial difference which typified a conflict that has lasted millennia. This exclusive god was in stark contrast to the inward-dwelling deity of the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Brahmins, and the early Christians. Their deity, a being, or beingness, was depicted as a universal, all-encompassing, innate force, found by denial of and unattachment to the external, material world. A deep refusal of the sensual was the key to spiritual attainment in this belief system. The conflict between these two systems is the keystone of all myth, going as far back as antediluvian legend. And although it has the deepest significance to our present situation, it has been masked so successfully over the past 120 years that the vast majority of mankind has no idea that it makes up the critical subtext of our familial, national, racial, and spiritual lives. If we have no idea that we are even on a battleground, how can we be expected to successfully resolve this all-encompassing conflict? It has never been more crucial that we face this situation, that we not only confront the external aspects, but more critically, we cannot succeed if we are not anchored in the reality of our true selves. This is where we discover universal brotherhood, the higher self of all. What occurred during the last quarter of the 19th century to set us on this course of obscuration from not only the reality of our situation, but the reality of our place and purpose in the cosmos? To understand this, we need to understand cyclic evolution and its manipulation. In particular, the 100-year cycle of spiritual precipitation. Around the 75th year of each century, there is an explosion of cultural change, ranging from the philosophical to the scientific to the spiritual. All of these in combination create reverberations, which set the course for successive generations. The revolutionary changes which occurred in every facet of Western society in the 20 years surrounding 1775 are obvious to anyone with a cursory knowledge of history. It is the two periods which encompass the pivotal years of 1875 and 1975 which are going to be of the most importance to this work, because the changes which occurred were so deep-seated and are key to understanding our current situation. An avalanche of metaphysical literature exploded into the West in the years around 1875. The flow of work concerning spiritualism, the paranormal, mesmerism, the astral world, Atlantis, and Eastern mysticism continued into the next century, spawning hundreds of different societies and groups that would change the face of the West, bringing it to new plateaus of understanding. At the same time, many of the backwards dogmas which had plagued humanity fell away, withered by new discoveries in science and archaeology, some of these spawning their own dogmatic materialism. Out of the fog of this conflict between science and religion came the Theosophical Society, founded by Helena Blavatsky in 1875. The society renewed the ancient Aryan wisdom religion, its principal object being to, quote, form the nucleus of a universal brotherhood of humanity, without distinction of race, creed, sex, caste, or color. Without the massive spread of the society, the words reincarnation and karma would be almost unknown in the West. These two concepts were an immense threat to the dogmatism and control of the Vatican, itself long a proxy of the tribal Abrahamic sect, since the adaptation of the Old Testament and its heresy of separation, the idolization of the psychopathic Jehovah. True Christianity, the words of Christ, were actually in full alignment with the Aryan concepts of theosophy, and this fact began to draw hundreds of thousands of disaffected Christians to meetings which spread like wildfire across the West, tired of the strict, unquestioning dogma of the dead letter of organized religion. The Jesuits, themselves formed by tribe members forced to convert to Catholicism or conversos, were assigned to sabotage and discredit the society. The ideas of national and racial identity were seen to be as natural as an extended family to theosophists, and almost all of the first nationalist groups in America were formed by members of the society. This is not the calumniated nationalism of the present day. There was a time when recognition and celebration of your identity was not interpreted as hatred of other nationalities and races. They stood up against the abuses of scientific materialism and started subgroups in protest against vivisection and eugenic practices. These facets of theosophical doctrine, especially the promotion of national identity with socialism and primal divinity of humanity as opposed to original sin, brought it in direct conflict with what they termed the Black Lodge. It is very rare to find mention of black sorcery or the use of occult powers for selfish ends, whether for individual or tribe, in the theosophical literature. Theosophy did, however, tell many secrets, which had heretofore been hidden by the power brokers, occult or political. The knowledge of mankind's true history, in short, the descent from spirit into increasing materiality, and the primal conflict between the lunar, tribal, materialistic hoarders of power and the solar, altruistic universal brotherhood, was something that a group whose intention was the formation of a global slave state wanted to keep under wraps. The destruction and concealment of knowledge and artifacts critical to mankind's understanding of itself, in particular the history of conflict between the different Aryan and Semitic tribes and civilizations, has reached a fever pitch in the past 30 years. The wars in the Middle East for Israeli hegemony have made it possible to carry out the industrial-scale destruction and looting of sites tremendously important to Aryan history. The Israeli proxy group ISIS has been responsible for most of these campaigns, most notably those at Palmyra and Bamiyan, with the tribe's archaeologists in command and following close behind. Sometimes the looting is carried out quite openly and under the noses of Western military authorities. This was certainly the case with the large-scale looting of the museums of Baghdad during the war in Iraq. There are 4 main reasons for this ongoing operation. First, to protect the tribe's fabricated and self-serving legend of its own origin and history, including any record of their crimes and tactical protocols, especially the fantasies detailed in the Old Testament. Second, to conceal and obliterate the history and mythology of their adversary, the Aryans. Third, to hide any chronicle of the conflict between these two groups, the Mahabharata being the best known of these records, to escape destruction. Finally, and most importantly, to achieve control over the history of humanity's spiritual and material progress through millennia, including the knowledge of historical cycles. The disconnection of a targeted group from its history and traditions is a well-worn technique used in the art of slavery. A major victory was achieved in this campaign with the almost complete obliteration of the museums and libraries of Germany during the Second World War, and the pulping of tens of thousands of German publications and manuscripts after the war, during a long-term pacification program. Many ancient Aryan manuscripts, brought to Germany from Asia and the Far and Middle East over hundreds of years, by archaeologists and researchers like Max Mueller, were also destroyed or disappeared. In addition to these recorded losses, we will never know the extent of rare manuscripts held in private or lodge libraries, lost to targeted theft or wanton destruction. It is no mistake that many of the principal symbols and tenets of theosophy are today associated in mass media and academia with the darkest areas of human experience, and almost totally purged and even censored from modern discourse. The swastika, since the beginning of known history, a symbol of benevolence and goodwill, found in every civilization, is today illegal even to be shown publicly in almost every country of the West. The word Aryan, until the second half of the 20th century, a designation denoting the concepts of altruism, sacrifice, and the acceptance and love of humanity, no matter the race or nationality, is today associated with bigotry, hatred, genocide, and racial supremacy. National Socialism, a political ideology that strikes horror in the hearts of every ruthless banking house and modern-day slave master, is today linked with tyranny in the minds of every high school history student. Even in the so-called truth community, Theosophy and its 19th century founders are calumniated as promoters of one world government under some kind of Antichrist avatar. This is the furthest thing from the truth, and can be found nowhere in their literature. It can, however, be found in the works of those who split from the original society to form groups which would use a distorted, manipulated version of the original truth to further their own cults of personality. This split is never mentioned by those who see it as their mission to shield humanity from a desperately needed guidance through the truth of their situation. The possibility that humanity would come to a realization of their inherent divinity, that they need not depend on anything outside of themselves for spiritual sustenance, is the biggest threat to tyranny, to slavery, to the collective Stockholm syndrome so many labor under. Therefore, it is of the utmost importance to this malevolent program that those consciously seeking truth are diverted from exploring the wisdom religion, the timeless trunk of truth, from which all variations of doctrine branch from. Throughout history, this stream of knowledge has been by turns protected, promulgated, and where necessary hidden by personalities known and unknown. Names like Plato, Giordano Bruno, Paracelsus, Iamblichus, Lao Tse, Patanjali, and countless others echo through history, some celebrated, many more persecuted, tortured, and intentionally obliterated, their names now covered by the sands of time. We live in an era when, without a doubt, men and women such as these would go unrecognized. When a personality like Walt Whitman would most likely be living in a tent and scrounging through trash bins to survive. His poetry seen as the ravings of a lunatic. When an Emerson or Dickinson would surely go unrecognized by a present society so celebratory of ugliness, its toxicity would overwhelm them. We need not even go back that far. How would a James Taylor or Cat Stevens fare in the music industry of today? Would they make it past the open mic night at your local bar? It is not the present situation that these artists and poets would not find an audience. What has occurred is that the worlds of publishing, music promotion, art in whole has been so thoroughly monopolized by a tribe so unquestionably dedicated to the degeneration of society. The voice of an artist deviating from this program will likely never reach you. This is beyond debate at this point. Simply look at the top 40 of the 1970s and compare it to the current version. It is unnecessary to even go into the details. What should be understood is that during the 1970s, this monopoly had already been in effect for at least 30 years. Although the singer-songwriter era of the mid-1970s seems more human, more empathetic, it must be understood that this genre was an essential step down the path from gold to lead, one that shall be explored in more depth in a succeeding chapter. This genre is, however, of importance in our present exploration of the spiritual precipitation around the year of 1975. The explosion of spiritual exploration and the subsequent release of information vital to the liberation of humanity from dogmatic and exploitative religious institutions, which occurred in 1875, was a tremendous obstacle to the tribe's program. They had not yet come close to accomplishing the almost full-spectrum domination of public life and culture they would achieve by the midpoint of the next century, and which would have been used to emulate, manipulate, and divert this natural cycle for their own purposes. In anticipation of this same cyclic repeat occurring in the years around 1975, all of the tools they had been perfecting, cinema, television, radio, popular music, and publishing, would be utilized. In addition to the cultural tools, the tribe's prominence in medicine, education, science, economics, and nuts and bolts sociological disciplines like population planning would come to the fore with the birth of the problem generation, or Generation X, specifically those children born around the year 1975. Besides the spiritual precipitation having its deepest effect on those who would spend the integral first years immersed in it, these children would also be the witnesses of great cultural changes they could not successfully be programmed to be ignorant of. As the children of the program's subject population, the baby boomers, they would be able to compare their grandparents' generation to their highly conditioned parents. The divorce-prone, argumentative, self-centered, narcissistic, and highly conditioned lives of their parents would look very strange indeed in contrast to the stable, traditional, cohesive, and religious families of their grandparents. The baby boomers had been heavily programmed to believe that the idea of any kind of overarching conspiratorial agenda being carried out by elites was the province of kooks and misfits who would never get laid. Their children would have no choice but to notice the tremendous cultural changes. They were the ones who would be forced to experience the real-life consequences of integration, the manufacturing collapse, the pervasive drug use, the exploding prison industry, the massive increase in immigration, the general and unending degeneration of popular culture. In short, things would always get worse for Generation X, and they would have the highest likelihood of noticing these tremendous alterations. As with witnesses to a crime, the perpetrator must wipe them out to succeed in carrying out their plan without being caught, and 1973 would see the lowest birth rate in recorded history. There were many factors in this sudden and deep decline. The birth control pill and Roe v. Wade case legalizing abortion the year before being the most obvious. Both of these nuts and bolts changes in the world of medicine were overwhelmingly dominated by tribe members, as were more subtle cultural changes like feminism that had tremendous effect on birth rate. Though I will not be exploring more deep occult subjects like gematria in this work, it is interesting to note that the word sacrifice works out to the number 73 in that system. The Old Testament massacre of innocents is also something hard to ignore when taking into account the notion of spiritual precipitation and its effect on those born during the years in question. The attack on those born in the 7 years between 1973 and 1980 continues to the present day with much higher numbers of suicide, drug abuse, depression, deaths of despair, etc., than even succeeding generations. Punk rock, heavy metal, goth, grunge, all of these nihilistic subcultures were intentionally designed to kill off, divert from rebellion, and subdue this problematic generation. In the black population, the promotion and glorification of gang warfare, gangster rap, the prison industry, and drug abuse would all combine to the same effect for the same age group. Just as we hit childbearing age, factors like the media-fueled hysteria around AIDS and sexual harassment, the celebration of abortion, and a virulent form of feminism which cast all men as rapists, would serve to keep many of us from carrying on our generation's influence into the future by creating families. It is not uncommon to see the mass media, when discussing generations, totally skip Generation X. to go from baby boomers straight to their almost carbon copy cohorts, the millennials. We are a generation which will be lost to history. This book is in part a requiem for those lost witnesses who fought so hard to survive something no other generation in history had ever lived through. The attempted hijacking of the soul of humanity on a worldwide scale. The prediction and subsequent elimination of groups prone to rebellion against a slave master is a technique as old as civilization itself. Some of the more brutal examples are given in the Old Testament. In the 20th century, more subtle techniques evolved through think tanks and institutions, employing anthropologists and sociologists as the intellectual foot soldiers of social control. As the boa constrictor's grip becomes tighter, its victim begins to struggle that much more, and it would be highly naive to think this struggle for liberation would not be anticipated and methods developed for pacification of the victim. No matter how gradually these changes are instituted, there will be those who notice and attempt to alert the public. Today, these people are called conspiracy theorists and are promptly ostracized from society at the first hint of deviation from the program. The notion that groups who hold power would conspire to retain and increase that power was an idea that was accepted as a logical conclusion before the 1960s. With the JFK and RFK assassinations, and all the glaring discrepancies that swirled around their official explanations, the term conspiracy theorist was coined by intelligence agencies to deflect and ostracize anyone who asked even the most obvious questions about these events. This campaign was so successful, especially with baby boomers, anyone who even hints at a version of events straying from the official narrative is instantly shut down. It doesn't matter how many facts are presented, how much evidence uncovered. It isn't about truth. It is about consensus, about belonging. A tribally controlled media creates the narrative, and anyone who strays is ostracized to the point of being labeled a criminal. Truth no longer matters. Being on the winning side does. This brings us to the point that a wider conclusion must be considered. Until the massive, pervasive, and unescapable presence of total media saturation with radio, television, and print media in the mid-20th century, society proceeded along on what could be called an organic consensus frequency. Their ideas were not being dictated to them by anything other than religious groupings that for the most part sprung from the same ethical and moral trunk. To develop ideas about ideology, theology, philosophy, or politics, one would have to go looking for them. You had the choice whether to enter these arenas of thought or simply go along surviving and attempting to enjoy life where you could. Consciously or unconsciously, most sought a higher ideal that was general and usually related to the golden rule of do unto others. This was an organic human frequency that pertained across all social and political borders and had existed without interruption from the beginning of time. The deep intention of the American dream was the realization of an extremely diverse population dedicated to this general, all-encompassing ideal of human relations. That no matter how different our soul's vehicles were, at core we were the same. The higher self was the higher self of all. The main thesis of this work is that this organic frequency was successfully hijacked, using total media saturation as its main technique. What has been termed the long march through institutions, like government and academia, could be seen as the preparation of the soil in which the seeds of television, popular music, mass-market publishing, and today's social media could be planted and used to carry out a very specific agenda of enslavement. The idea of a 50-year or even 500-year plan sounds ridiculous to those who have been disconnected from the idea of an immortal soul. Yet they have existed for thousands of years. The rise of a reactionary, badly thought-out atheism and the rejection of any spiritual anchor has dominated popular culture for the past 60 years and left a giant hole in the lives of those who fell victim to it. The tribe was right there waiting to fill that hole with an artificial and unnatural substitution, dedicated to separation and atomization through fabricated grievances revolving around identity. In the place of devotion to a benevolent deity that had sustained humanity for thousands of years, we were given celebrity. In the place of religious ritual, we were given awards shows and sports spectacles. In place of a priesthood, we were given men in white coats calling themselves experts. Humanity's descent into more and more material forms is an integral part of our evolution that takes place over tens of thousands of years. Most are totally unaware of this. Many are aware and see it as a test of strength, lasting many successive lifetimes, which will be followed by a gradual ascent back to spirit, back to our home. Then there is that tiny group, not even making up a percentile of the world's population, who are aware of this process and use that knowledge to exploit and enslave the ignorant mass. One of their techniques is the anticipation and manipulation of the natural cycles we are all subject to. The conflict between those who want to share knowledge for the benefit of all humanity and those who wish to hoard that knowledge for purposes of enslavement is one of the defining conflicts of Earth life. It is as simple as selfishness versus altruism. What are the characteristics of this spiritual precipitation, which occurs roughly every 100 years? For those who were alive during the 1970s, it is difficult to articulate to one who did not experience it. For many years I assumed that it was only because I was a child that this period took on a kind of magical significance. To be sure, I was in exactly the right place at the right time. I spent my first 8 years at a married student housing complex for the University of California, San Diego, located on the south coast of California in the small beach town of La Jolla. What was then a lazy college town in a breathtakingly scenic setting is today a parish of the ultra-rich, a socio-economic change which is common to all coastal towns in California without exception. We were far from wealthy, and the university-owned grouping of World War II-era apartment buildings was inhabited mostly by a diverse group of single-mother graduate students and their children, living a short walk from the beach. It was what could be called the absolutely perfect setting to experience the mid to late 70s. There were endless potlucks, parties, dances, spontaneous get-togethers, and casual meetings to discuss life at the complex. The children spent all day outside, at the beach, or going from apartment to apartment, with the other women serving as a de facto group motherhood for all the children without question. Boyfriends and ex-husbands came and went, and any kind of authority was extremely lax, which resulted in an unending stream of mischievous incidents, with hardly any punishment. All of this carried on to a soundtrack that extolled love, love, and more love. Although in a determinedly more idyllic setting than most, this was not very much different circumstantially than most American childhoods during this time. Children ran free with no supervision. There was constant, spontaneous, and organic community activity, and there was an air of acceptance and tolerance. To be sure, there were instances during this time of an exploitation of this tolerance and freedom. The murder of freewheeling hitchhikers probably the most typical example, but they were aberrations, and it is rare to find anyone who was alive then, even those who are grindingly poor, that do not remember it with fondness. The overall feeling was one of wholesomeness, oneness. People had many sexual encounters, but they were not cheap or artificial, and were seen as expressions of love. It was probably one of the least atomized periods of American cultural history, and bitter racial divisions that had been so exasperated during the previous decade seemed to evaporate to a point. All of this was in spite of, not contiguous to, the tribal agenda. Yet they had predicted and prepared for this period. They knew that there were going to be many chances for exploitation of these years of freedom and, most importantly, tolerance. And like the unwary hitchhiker, America would fall victim to a cunning tribal agenda that had never taken a break. They would ruthlessly take advantage of faltering or non-existent obscenity laws, going so far as to openly sell child pornography in states that had never, in their wildest dreams, believed they could actually require a law against something so vile. The justice system, by then under the almost total domination of tribe members, became notoriously lax, especially concerning sex crimes and crimes against children. Wealthy pedophiles across the country would start their own Boy Scout troops and summer camps for disadvantaged children, and use them as vacation spots for wealthy and prominent members of society, including judges, politicians, and corporate heads, to fulfill their basest desires. These camps would actually be subsidized by the state, so in effect these men were paid by the government to run child sex camps and pornography production facilities. Many of these encounters between prominent men and boys were filmed, and used as blackmail in the forwarding and implementation of the agenda, in the same fashion as the Epsteins of today. Even in mainstream cinema, pedophilia was repeatedly hinted and winked at in blockbuster films like Little Darlings, Bad News Bears, and Meatballs. Hundreds of children were brutally murdered during this time, their killers taking advantage of the lax parental supervision and the prevalence of runaways. The bodies of 300 young boys were found along the highways of Los Angeles alone during this period, all of them sexually abused and mutilated. There is no need for me to go any deeper into this carnage, as it has been amply documented and glorified for the past 50 years. What is important to note is that, as I said in the introduction, pornography and the influence of the mass entertainment media played a starring role as the impetus for much of this destruction. The lawlessness and especially the grotesque nature of many of these crimes, combined with the lackluster punishment, created a backlash among a terrified public that would go on to feed two integral components of the program: the prison industrial complex and the militarization of police. These two heads of the hydra of state control would partly manifest with the creation of SWAT teams across North America. In the tradition of television programs being used for state propaganda, the SWAT team would even get its own primetime series. Everything that is celebrated or remembered fondly by those my age or older about this period of time, the openness, the tolerance, the freedom, the sense of community and acceptance of the outsider or stranger, had a flip side that was exploited to forward an agenda of degeneration. The effects are still strongly prescient today, and were definitely felt most acutely by Generation X, the unwanted child, the inconvenient witness. I will concentrate further on this period in a later chapter, detailing the effects of the popular music of the time, and in particular, its form of presentation in arena concerts as a mass ritual. The intention of this chapter is to make the reader aware of some key points and concepts that are integral to understanding my main thesis. In short, there are cultural, philosophical, spiritual cycles that humanity goes through in a much larger scale evolution, from a spiritual home to a more material existence, and then back again, an involution, to a hopefully more ethical and moral position than they inhabited at the starting point. We go through this progression individually, as a race, and in fact as soul substance in general on a universal scale. The occult knowledge of these cycles on a much more detailed level than I have elaborated here can be used, as all occult knowledge can, for good or selfish intention. That the prediction and manipulation of these cycles, at the societal scale especially, has been used in part as a technique of social control, and that the prediction of the birth of a generation prone to rebellion against this agenda during a cyclic point of spiritual precipitation played a large part in the creation of our present degenerate cultural state. The implementation of this technique of rebellion, prediction, and diversion would have as its target Generation X. The overall project would take place between the years 1945 and 1994, and the baby boom generation, in particular those born between 1945 and 1950, would be playing the starring role as its oblivious subject. This 50-year plan would be comprised of 7 distinct genres of 7 years each. These genres, distinguished by major shifts in the cultural vessels of music, literature, cinema, and television. That there has been no major or even minor change in popular culture in the 26 years since 1994 is not a mistake. The project had come to an end. It was a wrap, so to speak, and Western civilization, the dominant force in world influence, had been irrevocably torn apart and put back together again in a form preferred by its new masters. I will be returning to Generation X when we arrive at the 4th genre, but for the most part, the rest of this work will concern the most studied, programmed, and successfully manipulated generation in history, the baby boomer.